1 Thessalonians 5, but I'm going to do the second part of a section that comes up on leadership. The verse in question is verse 12 through 13 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. Now we ask you, brothers, to respect those who labour among you and rule over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them beyond all measure in love because of their work. We started looking at leadership. So primarily this verse is talking about the attitude of the congregation towards the leaders. But I also am taking the opportunity to look at leadership in general as far as the church is concerned. I want to just inject this Matthew 16 into this. I should have included it last time I preached, but I didn't. In this particular place, Jesus comes to Caesarea Philippi, and this is Matthew 16, verses 13 through 18. And he asks, who do the people say that I am? So in other words, he's asking the apostles, what's the people's general opinion of who I actually am? And Peter has various suggestions. John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, one of the prophets. But then Jesus asked, but who do you say that I am? And he said, you are, if I can find it, you are the Christ, that's in verse 16, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And then we've got the discussion about the rock and the pebble. Jesus said, on this rock, you are Peter, which is a pebble, and on this rock, and the word there is bedrock, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. Verse 18. Now, what I want to emphasize here, the church as such didn't exist at this point. We're still at the end of the Old Testament period. The law of Moses is still in effect. So the nation of Israel is the house of God. But Jesus says, I will build my church. The rock there is the statement that Peter made, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the foundation of the church. If Jesus wasn't the Son of God, the church would be pretty much meaningless. It would be a body of people getting together, with good ideas maybe, but there'd be no real foundation to it. But with Jesus as the Son of God, the church is everything. But notice he said, I, Jesus, will build my church. In other words, Jesus is going to be the builder of the church. So what is he, the big thing to think about here is, what does Jesus mean to build his church? He's certainly not talking about a physical building, but he is talking about the structure or the organization and the teaching of the body which he is about to bring into existence. And the church, the ecclesia, really means the assembly. It's not, strictly speaking, the called out. The word church was used by a political group, a sports group. It's just an assembly of people come together for a particular purpose. So Jesus is saying, I will build my assembly of people. So the building of it would involve not anything physical, but the spiritual nature of the church, the way the church is organized, the teachings of the church, etc. What activities the church is to be involved in. When Jesus says, I will build my church, that's what he's talking about. Okay, so then we get down to Ephesians chapter 2, verses 19 through 22. Talking about the people who have become part of what it describes here as the household of God, which is just the church. And then in verse 20, referring to the church or the household of God, built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. So Jesus is the builder, but it's based on the work, the activities, the teachings of the apostles and the prophets. And the prophets in this case are those who spoke directly from God, gave instructions to the congregations, to the people, directly from God. Jesus Christ himself being the cornerstone. So again, the church is built based on Jesus. The cornerstone was the first thing they would put down, or the first stone they would put down, which gave reference to the way the whole of the building was built. Everything went back to that cornerstone to get it square, vertical, whatever you wanted. That's what the building went back to. So the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Christ Jesus himself being the cornerstone. So if you put those two together, I will build my church, and it will be according to the teachings, the foundation, the principles that the apostles and prophets will give. And it will all go back to Jesus Christ himself. Why am I emphasizing this so much? How did Jesus build the church in terms of the, if you like, the leadership or the organization of the church? And we see that in Ephesians 4, which I went over last week, so I won't spend much time on. Ephesians 4, 11 through 20. He gave some as apostles, some as prophets, some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers. That is the way, if you like, Jesus built the church. As far as the leadership of the church, what he appointed was apostles, prophets, that those two offices have finished, some as evangelists, and some as pastors and teachers. So the office of the evangelist is just someone who speaks on behalf of God. What we tend to call the preacher. I like the term evangelist better. But the person who is appointed to be the preacher over a congregation, that office, if you like, is appointed by God, by Jesus. He set it up. We didn't just get together and say, oh, what sort of a system would we like, etc. This is the system which God appointed. So some as evangelists and some as pastors and teachers. And we knew from, we'll get on to it, but we know already that the pastors and teachers seems to be referring to the same group, which is the elders. You've got some as apostles, that's one group. Some as prophets, that's another group. Some as evangelists, that's another group. And then some as pastors and teachers. So the wording is different for the pastors and teachers, which to me indicates we're talking about the same group of people. And we know that the pastor, the elder, what some call the bishop, overseer, presbyter, etc., are the same office. Okay? And the purpose of that was for the building, for the equipping of the saints, for helping us to become a better building, a better church for Jesus. My real point is, if we change that structure, who built it? Jesus said, I will build my church. So if we come up with a single guy who's basically runs a congregation, he's the boss, and we call him pastor, even though the word pastor does exist, poimen. Did Jesus build that? Or did man build that? If we don't find it in the New Testament, if we don't find it taught by the apostles, does that come from God? It does not. So if that's our organization, we're part of an organization that was not built by Jesus. It was built by man. You've got an organization where you've got a head office around the world. You've got one head office in New York. You've got each country has its own head office. And then you've got individual leaders of congregations who are responsible to the head office in your country and ultimately the head office in the world. Is that system built by God? When Jesus said, I will build my church through the apostles and the prophets, and we don't see that in the New Testament, did it come from God? Is that the church that is built by God? And the answer has to be no, it was not. So if it wasn't built by God, If it wasn't the church that Jesus built, can we expect it to save us? And again, the answer has got to be no, because this is not Jesus' organization. This is not the assembly that Jesus built. It doesn't matter whether we call it a church, the Bible calls it a church, but is that the assembly that Jesus built? And absolutely, that's not the case. I think there's a tendency even in the church, what we understand as the church, for the change the names for help with various things that they're trying to do that the Bible doesn't actually teach. I don't think we can do that either. Jesus built it with apostles, prophets, evangelists, or preachers. Both those terms are used, although it's the evangelists and the preachers the same thing. And some as pastors. That's the structure, if you like, that Jesus built with the church. If we do anything different, then we're saying, Jesus, you built it wrong. This is how you should have done it. We just simply cannot do that. We're responsible to Jesus, not responsible to what we think is the best way of doing it. Okay, so that's something I left out last week, which afterwards I thought I should have included, but I totally believe that is true. If we depart from the pattern, the structure that Jesus built, we have departed from Jesus. We are no longer trusting Jesus. And that word pistis, which we commonly translate believe, simply means trust. I think in that class, when he talked about all the Israelites that didn't go into Israel because they were scared to, basically, and Jesus said, okay, all of you except the two that said we should go in, all the rest aren't going to go in. And in the translation, I think we looked at, it wasn't, their attitude wasn't combined with faith or belief. No, I think actually the wording was belief. It wasn't that they didn't believe in God. They did believe in God. The fact was they didn't trust him to keep them safe if they went into that country of Israel. So it wasn't a lack of belief in God, it was a lack of trust in God. That's why they were not allowed to go in. They simply didn't trust God. And that's the same thing here. If we do it any different way, we are not trusting God to say this is the right way of doing it. If God has given a way, we can't change it. Not our job. We're not the lawgivers. We're just the ones who are supposed to obey it. Okay, so when we get on to the style of leadership which God wants. And I know this section, Matthew 20, we went over it. But I think it is really important, so I want to just briefly touch on it again. And this is the case in Matthew 20, 20 through 28, where the mother of the sons of Zebedee, which was James and John, she and probably they wanted to have the top jobs in the kingdom when Jesus was established. And normally you would expect in a kingdom that the top jobs, they're the cushy jobs. They're the ones with the most benefit. You can order people around, you can tell them what to do and they've got to do it. You know, that sounds pretty good. And then the 12 hear about this, or the 10, because James and John were part of it, heard about it and they got a bit upset with these two and they complained to Jesus that they want the top jobs. I think Jesus is really incredible the way he responded to them. And this again is somewhat of an example of excellent leadership. In verse 25 of Matthew 20, Jesus said, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those in high positions exercise authority over them. The heart of the matter was that it was normal for the world's leadership to have bosses and underlings. That's just the normal way of doing it. And the higher up you got, the more you were able to push other people around and get them to do what you wanted and very often abuse that position. That was just normal. So Jesus is saying, look, don't complain too much about these guys. That's up till now, that's been the normal way of doing things. But then in verse 26, he says, it will not be like that among you. In other words, don't take the world style of leadership as the style of leadership Jesus is going to establish within the church. But whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. I think it is good even as Christians to aspire to greatness. I think we all should be aspiring to greatness. But that greatness does not come in the form of how many people we can boss around, which is the conventional way of thinking of leadership. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And then he even strengthens that more in the next one. And whoever wants to be most prominent among you must be your slave. So the higher you want to go, the more you must make yourself a slave of, in this case, the congregation especially. And the example, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's the pattern, if you like, we have for any form of leadership within the church. We have people who sort of take up the role of being a leader, or they lead in some ways. They may not be appointed to an office, but because of their talents or whatever, they're acknowledged as leaders within the congregation. That's the style of leadership which those people must follow. If they do it differently, they're not following Jesus' form of leadership. And it's Jesus who built the church, not us. That applies to the style of leadership that's supposed to exist within the church as well. Now, if we want to look more specifically at elders, and I'll spend a little bit of time. I know we probably don't have anyone that would qualify as an elder, I'm not sure. Fred might be the closest. But unfortunately, you can't have one elder. It's always in the plural. But I do want to look at different aspects of the leadership. Maybe we'll go to different congregations at some point and there'll be elders there, or they'll want to appoint elders, or we'll get to the stage where we can appoint elders. So we need to have some understanding of it, because this is what Jesus built when he built the church. So 1 Peter 5, verses 1 through 5, we'll just look at the style of leadership which God required of elders. And that really is the top job in the earthly church, the elder. The preacher, I don't think, is. I know we're told that the preacher is allowed to discipline the elders only if it's required and only if there's 3 witnesses to back him up. But I'm quite sure also it works the other way. If the preacher plays up, the elders can fire him. So, but ultimately the elders are if you like, the rulers of the congregation. But they must be subject to what Jesus requires of them. They don't have carte blanche to do whatever they like. Okay, so 1 Peter 5. Therefore I, your fellow elder, witness of the suffering of Christ, and also a sharer of the glory that is going to be revealed, exhort the elders among you. So he's referring to elders in this particular passage. Notice too, he says, shepherd the flock of God. The word shepherd and pastor are the same word. Sometimes it's translated pastor, or the verb form of pastor, sometimes shepherd, but it is the same word. So when we're talking about pastors, we're actually, from a biblical point of view, the way Jesus set it up, we are talking about elders. So shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. So their role is to oversee the church in all its aspects, not by compulsion, but willingly. So they're not to do the work of an elder because they're being forced into it. They're doing it because they want to do it. They have the ability to do it. They want to see the congregation flourish and improve and grow spiritually. Therefore, they are willing to do it. Sometimes we push people into the office simply because we need elders. Sometimes you've got 2 elders and they don't get on. And this is a case I actually know about. So two elders push another guy in to try and be a moderator between the two. That's not. I think if those two elders can't get on, they probably shouldn't be elders because they're hurting the church. Okay, so not by compulsion, but willingly in accordance with God. In other words, they are responsible to God, and not greedily, but eagerly. Very often people use positions of authority to get rich, to gain advantage in some way. Some of the dictators of the world, when they end up not being a dictator, if they don't get killed, they're filthy, filthy rich. They've just amassed massive amounts of money. There is not many leaders of organisations that stop being the leader poor. There really isn't in the world. That's not what we're supposed to be doing as Christians, as the leaders. Verse 3, and not as lording it over those under your care. Lording it is an even stronger word than being bossy. Elders are not to be, or leaders in the church, in this case elders, are not to be bossy people. They're not to be people who are always pushing other people around. But lording is even stronger than that. But being examples for the flock. The emphasis that the elder should be doing is, certainly he can say what needs to happen because they ultimately have the role of directing and helping the church grow. But they are to emphasize, if you like, those instructions by their own example. And again, plenty of elderships don't operate that way. They should, but they don't. I think sometimes they feel threatened by the congregation, so they try and use force to get what they want rather than being reasonable. When I was thinking about this, I thought about a situation when we were in Albania one time. And this is outside the church, but it just emphasises what I'm talking about. I had a friend who was in government, real nice guy, and they'd had some American consultants come out to help them with a problem or help them develop something. I can't remember the details of it. But I asked the guy, how did that meeting go on? He said, oh no, they were useless. And I said, oh, why were they useless? These guys are top guys. He said, they told us what we should do, but there was just no emphasis. And what he meant was they weren't yelling and screaming at them to do stuff. They would just say, this is what you should do and this will work, But the Albanian way was, to yell and scream and pound the table and it didn't mean anything unless that was what was happening. And there's enough leaders use that, they try to get their will done by force. And if you do that often enough, if you don't have force, they're not serious about it. So we don't have to take any notice of them. But that's not the case in the church. Force, the exercise of power is not how leaders in the church are to get things done. Verse 4, and when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. Okay, if we can't make extra money out of being the leader of the church, if we can't get those benefits out of the church, then why should we bother doing it? That's why most people get into leadership. There's better money. And again, this kind of goes against what's normal. The benefits the leader gets in verse 4. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. You will get something far more valuable than money. So don't waste your time trying to use your leadership to gain money, gain prestige, whatever. Because in the end, if you do it right, God is going to give you a huge reward for your good work. So that's basically the style of leadership that we're supposed to have. I know there we're talking about elders, but it seems to me it applies to elders, it applies even more to those who are not elders. So when we're trying to be leaders within the church, this is how we're supposed to lead. Notice in the verse 5, in the same passage, 1 Peter 5, verse 5, then he says, in the same way, younger men, be subject to your elders. The emphasis on the leader is to lead in such and such a way, to do it the way God wants them to do it. The emphasis on, in this case, the younger men, but you could broaden that to the congregation, is to follow your leaders. That doesn't mean we can't object or say, look, I think that's not a good idea, and we discuss it, but ultimately it's the leader's decision. It may prove to be the wrong decision, but it's the congregation's job, including the preacher's job, to support the elders in their decisions. We can discuss things with them, but ultimately it is their decision for things. And then all of you clothe yourself with humility towards one another. To me, that's a really beautiful style of leadership within the church. You know, if you could live in that sort of an environment, be hugely more enjoyable than an environment where you've got certain people pushing everyone around and telling them what they can and can't do, and, you know, obviously trying to take advantage of them. You know, that's not a pleasant way to live. We have the greatest organisation in the world, and we should have the greatest leadership style in the world as well. Okay, I want to just very briefly look at the appointment of elders. 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. If anyone aspires, in this translation it's to supervision. You could translate that oversight. Some, I think, translate it the bishopric, because they're talking about the same thing. If anyone, but the root meaning is the oversight. So if anyone aspires to be an overseer, a bishop, an elder, etc., within the church, he desires a good work. So if you have the ability to do that, that's a really good thing that you're wanting to do. Because good leadership will produce good congregations. Bad leadership will produce bad congregations. Just all there is to it. Therefore, the overseer must be, and then we've got a kind of a list of different qualities that the overseer must have. The overseer must be irreproachable, blameless, another word which we could possibly translate there, which in Titus 1 used instead, the husband of one wife. One wife, a little bit difficult. What about someone who's been divorced and remarried? So over his lifetime he's on his second wife or third wife or fourth wife. I think it depends on whether that's a legitimate divorce or not, personally. If he's remarried but he didn't have the right to remarry, then he's living with someone that's not really his wife in God's sight. If he's legitimately divorced because the wife went off with someone else, I think he's got an argument he can make. Certainly if he's a polygamist, that would absolutely count him out. But I think there's some of these things, if you're in the position of becoming an elder, you've got to decide for yourself what you think is right. And if you're put up for an elder and you think your marriage situation is wrong because although you believe it was legitimate divorce and remarriage, you've had two wives, therefore you feel like you shouldn't. I don't know. That's a difficult one. Okay, the husband of one wife, temperate. And a temperate person, fairly self-controlled, calm, not jumping up and down all the time, not yelling and screaming at the least opportunity. You know, pretty good quality for an elder really, or for anyone. Self-controlled, very similar thing. Then respectable. Someone who gains respect because of their lifestyle. Hospitable. Willing to give people a home if they need it for probably a short time, not permanently. This used to be a big thing in the church, that people were always inviting other people home for lunch. In the States, when I first went to the States, that happened all the time. You'd go to a congregation, I got invited out to preach quite a few times, and there'd be always someone invite you home for lunch. You know, if someone had nowhere to go, then someone would invite them home. It doesn't happen so much now, but to an extent, that's what it's talking about. But that hospitable character really sheds a lot of love within a congregation. Then this one says skillful in teaching, but I think it seems to me the translation is better able to teach. Doesn't have to be a master teacher, but he does have to be able to teach people. And then not addicted to wine. It doesn't say not someone who drinks any wine. And there's a difference between someone who will have an occasional wine and someone who is addicted to wine. So for the elder, it's not addicted to wine. Then not a violent person, but gentle. The emphasis there on gentle, a gentle person. Peaceable, it's a very similar thing. Not someone who loves money, manages his own household well, having children in submission with all dignity. Again, this one, is it in submission to the parents or is it in submission to God? I could not answer that definitively. Same within the next passage. We usually take it to mean faithful to God because of the parallel passage in Titus chapter 1. But I couldn't say absolutely for sure. Certainly you're best off having elders who have children who are faithful Christians. Then the other thing is what happens once they leave home. They're not really considered your child anymore. They've gone off, they've started their own home. If they fall away then, I really don't know. Verse 5, but if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? In terms of having children in submission with all dignity. In other words, he runs his family, including his children, very well. If he's no good at his family, how can he be any good at the church when the church has got so more people in it, so many more people, and there'll be so many more problems than your own family? The family's the easier one in some ways. And then in verse 6, not newly converted, a new convert, some translations have, lest he become conceited and fall into the condemnation of the devil. But he must also have a good testimony for those outside. So the people who are, the men who are appointed as elders, and it is always in the masculine form, it's always men, must have a good testimony. In other words, they must be respected by those outside the church. And certainly I've heard of people who become elders, but they're really bad business people and they are not respected outside the church. They may behave themselves in terms of what's required of the church, but in terms of their conduct outside the church, they are not respected at all. But he must also have a good testimony of those that said, in order that he may not fall into disgrace and the trap of the devil. Very quickly, Titus 1, 5 through 9, and count this I left you behind in Crete in order that what remains may be set in order, and you may appoint elders in every town. Maybe then there was only one congregation per town. I know things have changed. But we know that one eldership does not have authority over another congregation that it's not part of. As I ordered you, if anyone is blameless, and there's a lot of comparison, these two lists of qualifications, if you like, are slightly different. The one in 1 Timothy 3 is the longer one. It includes more. Especially some of the things about the family are not included in Titus. So there's one in Titus that's not as such included in the other one. What do we make of that? I'm inclined to think that anything that is in either list is required. That's the way I would see it. Because God set up the church, Jesus set up the church. It's laid through the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. Paul wrote this. He's an apostle. So what he wrote in both of them, I think, needs to be part of the qualifications of the elder. It doesn't matter. Okay, so if anyone is blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children, not accused of dissipation or rebellious. Dissipation actually comes from a word that is the negative form of righteous. So in other words, he's, if you like, unrighteous, but it became meaning someone who had really no concern whatsoever over the consequences of his actions. He'd do what suited him, didn't matter if someone else was hurt because of it. For it is necessary for the overseer to be blameless as God's steward, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not violent, not greedy for dishonest gain, but hospitable, loving what is good, prudent, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast to the faithful message according to the teaching, in order that he may be able both to exhort and with sound instruction and to reprove those who speak against it. In other words, able to teach. And if he's not teaching the word, if he's gone off into some other thing, we should not allow him to teach the congregation. Very quickly, and I'm going to have to finish here, the role of women in leadership. Now, that's a big thing today. 1 Timothy 2, the whole passage goes through 9 through 15. But in the first section from 9, Paul talks about the example of the woman. But then in verse 11 he said a woman must learn, in quietness and all submission. But I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. How did God build the church? How did Jesus build the church? He built it with the men in the leadership role and the women in a supportive role. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Do you believe the Bible? If you do, you've got to accept that statement. Then, but to remain quiet. Remember, they were to learn in quietness and all submission. In other words, they were to take in what the leaders were teaching them. Not to argue about it. Not to get up and try to teach lessons that they think are better than the men's. Nothing to do with whether the woman's a better speaker than the man. It's got nothing whatsoever to do with it. In many cases they are. And in business now, when it goes into public, it's usually the women that are the speaker. In many, many cases, because they present better than men. But in the church, they are not given that role. In fact, they are forbidden from that role. Why? Verse 13, nothing whatsoever to do with culture. For Adam was formed first. Is that ever going to change? You take a point in history and you look at the reasons given here for women not preaching or not having authority over men. Will facts ever be different no matter what point in history you are in? You're in Jesus' time. If you're in the year 1500, would these facts be any different? The year 2020, will these facts be any different? Because these are the reasons why God does not allow women to teach or to have authority. Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman, because she was deceived, came into transgression. But she will be saved through the bearing of children if she continues in faith and love and holiness with self-control. Who is the greater than the male leader or the woman that's learning in quietness? Who's the greater? It's got nothing whatsoever to do with either of those situations. The greatest is the one who serves most effectively. And to be honest, very often it's the women who do that. Very often. Been in the odd congregation where women take a more of a leadership role, and believe me, most of the men just sit down and do nothing. The women are the ones up preparing the Lord's Supper. They're opening the windows, they're cleaning, you know. I think God's done it this way because men have to be forced to lead. They're lazy. Some say very often. They don't want to put themselves forward. You know, that's too much hassle. You know, you'll get criticised. But it's just the way God has set it up. We are the followers, not the leaders. We must do it God's way. Okay, we're going to have to finish there. I know I've gone a bit over time. I won't make a part 3 out of it, even though you've got a few more verses there. You can go through them and have a look at them and see what you can learn from it. So we'll carry on with 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 next week.